Judge tries to find black woman in court, stunned when he learns her true power. Judge Henry Calloway adjusted his glasses, his sharp gaze dropping to the docket. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, a familiar hum of restless energy. People shuffled papers, whispered to one another, or stared blankly ahead, waiting for their turn. Next case, Brianna Cole versus City Hall, the bailiff announced. The name sparked no recognition for Judge Calloway. As he flipped through the case file, it seemed like routine municipal work. Miss Cole was accused of operating an unlicensed street vending business. A simple infraction, hardly worth much deliberation. But then he noticed a slight stir among the gallery. Heads turned, whispers picked up. Curious, he glanced toward the defendant. The click of heels echoed on the polished courtroom floor as Brianna Cole approached the defendant's table. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, and her head held high. She wore a tailored navy blazer that contrasted sharply with the casual demeanor of the courtroom's usual visitors. Her natural curls framed an expression that was both calm and sharp, her gaze direct and unwavering. Something about her struck him. Confidence, yes, but also a quiet intensity that seemed to fill the room. "Miss Cole, please state your name for the record," he said, his voice even, though he found himself intrigued. "Brianna Cole," she replied smoothly. Her voice was steady, but there was an undertone that commanded attention. Judge Calloway leaned back slightly, observing her. "You've been charged with operating an unauthorized vending business in violation of Municipal Code Section 234A. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing clear. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. The judge frowned, silencing the room with a sharp rap of his gavel. "Miss Cole," he began, his tone taking on a faint edge, "the evidence presented here indicates you've been operating without a permit. Do you deny running a food cart?" Brianna clasped her hands in front of her, maintaining her composure. "I don't deny running a food cart, sir, but the claim that I did so without proper permits is incorrect." Her response was deliberate, every word chosen with care. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow, flipping through the case file again. "Then why does the city assert otherwise?" Her lips twitched slightly, almost a smile, as though she had anticipated this line of questioning. "Because, Your Honor, the city's records are incomplete, and the enforcement of this law is selective." Selective enforcement. That phrase caught his attention. He set down his pen and fixed her with a piercing stare. "Selective in what way?" Brianna tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful but firm. "In a way that disproportionately affects people like me. But I'm prepared to provide evidence that shows the inconsistency." The gallery murmured again, louder this time. Calloway rapped his gavel once more, his interest piqued despite himself. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Miss Cole, I hope you understand the seriousness of your claim. I trust you've come prepared to support it." "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't, Your Honor," she replied, her gaze never wavering. For the first time that morning, Judge Calloway felt the faint stirrings of curiosity. This was no ordinary case, and Brianna Cole was no ordinary defendant. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Thomas Weaver approached the podium, his briefcase clutched tightly. His expression carried a veneer of confidence, but there was a twitch in his jaw, a small giveaway to those paying close attention. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat, "the city maintains that Miss Cole knowingly operated without the necessary permits. We've documented her violations through inspections, photographic evidence, and testimony from municipal officers." He slid a folder across the table toward the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Calloway. Weaver straightened his tie and cast a glance at Brianna, as though expecting her composure to crack under the weight of his evidence. Brianna remained unflinching, her hands clasped lightly on the table before her. Her steady gaze met Weaver's, her expression calm, but with a glint of quiet defiance. "Miss Cole," Judge Calloway said, flipping through the folder, "these photographs appear to show your cart operating at various locations on multiple dates. Do you dispute their accuracy?" "Not the photos, Your Honor," Brianna replied, "but I do dispute the narrative attached to them." Weaver raised an eyebrow, his confidence flickering. "And what narrative would that be?" Brianna reached into her satchel and retrieved a slim binder. "The one that claims I was operating illegally," she said, sliding it toward the bailiff. "Contained here are my permits, emails from city officials confirming my compliance, and a timeline of my interactions with municipal officers. The city's claims don't hold up under scrutiny." Weaver's jaw tightened as Judge Calloway scanned the documents. A bead of sweat appeared on the prosecutor's temple, though he quickly dabbed it away with a handkerchief. "Irregularities in enforcement don't change the fact that the law is the law," Weaver countered. "You were warned multiple times about compliance issues." "Warned?" Brianna's lips curved slightly, the faintest trace of a smile. "Your Honor, I wasn't warned. I was ambushed. Inspectors appeared unannounced, refused to answer my questions, and issued citations without providing clarification. Meanwhile, other vendors in the same area, many of whom lacked permits entirely, were ignored." Weaver's composure faltered further. "That's a bold claim, Miss Cole." "It's not a claim," Brianna replied evenly. "It's documented. Through a Freedom of Information Act request, I obtained inspection logs showing that enforcement disproportionately targeted vendors like me. Minority-owned businesses accounted for 80% of citations in my district, despite being a fraction of the total operators." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Calloway silenced them with a sharp rap of his gavel, his sharp eyes narrowing on Weaver. "Mr. Weaver, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" Weaver hesitated, fumbling with his notes. "Your Honor, I would need time to verify these allegations, but I maintain that this case is about Miss Cole's noncompliance, not broader patterns of enforcement." "Mr. Weaver," Brianna interjected, her voice calm but firm, "selective enforcement isn't a side issue, it's the issue. When laws are applied unequally, they cease to be just. This case isn't just about me. It's about a system that punishes some while excusing others." Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Miss Cole, your evidence and arguments are compelling. However, this court must rule on the facts of your case. Are you asking me to disregard the evidence presented by the city?" "I'm asking you to consider all the evidence, Your Honor," Brianna replied. "If citations were issued in bad faith, then they're not valid. Upholding them would perpetuate the same bias that targeted me in the first place." The judge studied her for a long moment before shifting his gaze to Weaver. "Mr. Weaver, I expect a detailed review of the inspection logs and communications related to this case. Miss Cole's allegations raise serious concerns, and this court will not proceed without a thorough examination." Weaver nodded stiffly, his face pale. "Understood, Your Honor." Calloway rapped his gavel. "Court is in recess until further notice." As the courtroom emptied, Weaver hurriedly packed his briefcase, avoiding Brianna's gaze. She remained seated, organizing her materials with methodical precision. "You've made an impression," a voice said quietly. Brianna turned to see a man in a tailored suit standing near the gallery. His expression was thoughtful, his arms crossed. "Standing up to the city like that, not many people do," he added. Brianna gave a small, knowing smile. "It's not about standing up to the city, it's about standing up for what's right." The man nodded, watching her leave. As Brianna stepped into the sunlight outside, she knew this fight was far from over, but she had cracked the foundation, and she was ready to see it crumble. Judge Calloway's gaze bore into Weaver, the weight of the courtroom silence hanging heavy. "Mr. Weaver," he repeated, his voice sharp, "is this true? Were other vendors overlooked while Miss Cole was singled out?" Weaver adjusted his tie for the third time that morning. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on his brow, betraying his growing discomfort. I'd have to review the enforcement logs, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice faltering under the scrutiny. Brianna, who had maintained an aura of calm professionalism throughout the proceedings, let out a barely audible sigh. Her shoulders rose and fell with a measured breath, a small but telling crack in her composed exterior. "Your Honor," she said, her voice edged with controlled exasperation, "I've already done that work." She lifted a thick binder from her desk and passed it to the bailiff, her movements deliberate and confident. "This is a detailed breakdown of inspections conducted in my area over the past year. It clearly illustrates a stark disparity in how violations were handled. As the bailiff delivered the binder to the judge, Calloway adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the pages. The sound of rustling paper filled the room, each turn of the page building anticipation. His brows furrowed, his expression darkening as he scanned the contents. "These are official records?" he asked, his voice low but charged. "Yes, Your Honor," Brianna replied, her tone unwavering. "Obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request." Calloway's hand paused mid-turn, and for a fleeting moment, he glanced at Brianna with something other than judicial detachment. Her voice carried not just resolve, but the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting unseen battles for far too long. He felt a tug of discomfort, memories surfacing unbidden. A young woman standing in his office, years ago, pleading for leniency for a minor infraction that spiraled out of control because she couldn't afford the fines. Her face was blurred in his memory, but the shame he felt at brushing her off lingered vividly. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the table. "Your Honor, I'd like to point out that these records don't necessarily." Judge Calloway held up a hand, silencing Weaver mid-sentence. "Mr. Weaver, I'll decide what these records do or do not indicate," he said curtly, his voice carrying authority that made even the reporters in the gallery sit up straighter. Weaver's mouth snapped shut, and Brianna's expression softened just slightly. But the tension in her posture remained, a quiet battle raging within her. Relief at being heard versus the frustration of having to fight so hard to get to this point. "This is troubling," the judge said finally, setting the binder down. "However, Miss Cole, let me remind you that your countersuit is not what's on trial today. The matter before this court is whether you violated municipal law by operating without the proper permits." Brianna's jaw tightened for the briefest of moments. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency, "I understand that, but the context matters. If I'm being fined for a violation that others are allowed to commit without consequence, then this court would be upholding discrimination." The room held its collective breath. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade as everyone waited for the judge's response. Calloway leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. His gaze shifted between Brianna and Weaver, his expression unreadable. "Miss Cole," he said slowly, "you're walking a fine line between defending your case and challenging this court's impartiality." Brianna met his gaze head-on. "I mean no disrespect, Your Honor, but respect for the court doesn't mean ignoring its flaws. The law is only as fair as its enforcement, and in my case, enforcement has been anything but fair." Weaver seized the moment to regain his footing. "Your Honor, Miss Cole's assertions are speculative at best. The city's inspectors are professionals who enforce regulations without bias. To suggest otherwise..." "They're professionals?" Brianna interjected, her voice rising just enough to draw attention. "Then perhaps you can explain why one inspector verbally admitted to me that certain areas get more scrutiny than others during our last interaction." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Weaver's face flushed a deep red, and he fumbled for words. That's hearsay, Your Honor." "It's reality," Brianna countered, her voice firm but composed. "And it's backed by the data in that binder." Judge Calloway tapped his gavel lightly, restoring order. "Enough," he said, his tone brokering no argument. He turned to Weaver, his expression stern. "Mr. Weaver, it seems Miss Cole has presented credible evidence suggesting a pattern of unequal enforcement. Do you have any rebuttal beyond speculation?" Weaver hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "Your Honor, I would need time to review the records Miss Cole has submitted." "Time?" Brianna said, her frustration breaking through in a rare moment of candor. "I've been dealing with this for months. I didn't have the luxury of time when inspectors were shutting me down and threatening my livelihood." Judge Calloway's gaze snapped back to her, sharp but not unkind. "Miss Cole, you're not helping your case by letting your emotions get the better of you." Brianna took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table. "Apologies, Your Honor, but I'm not just fighting for myself here. I'm fighting for every vendor who's been unfairly targeted and pushed out of business." Weaver seized on her moment of vulnerability. "Your Honor, this is exactly my point. Miss Cole is turning this case into a referendum on city policy when it's simply about her failure to comply with the law. And yet, Brianna said, regaining her composure almost instantly, the city's enforcement of that law is at the heart of this case. If the enforcement is biased, then the charges against me are fundamentally unjust. Calloway sighed heavily, the weight of the case evident in the lines on his face. He looked down at the binder, then back up at Weaver. Mr. Weaver, you have until the end of the day to provide this court with a preliminary review of these records. If Miss Cole's allegations hold water, we'll have to reevaluate the city's enforcement practices before proceeding with the charges. Weaver's face fell, but he nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Brianna allowed herself a small smile, though the tension in her shoulders didn't fully ease. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like the scales might be tipping in her favor. This court will recess until 3 p.m., Calloway announced, rapping his gavel. As the room began to clear, Brianna gathered her belongings with deliberate care. She didn't want to show the weight she felt pressing down on her, not to the reporters, not to Weaver, not even to herself. Weaver lingered near the prosecution table, his expression conflicted. As Brianna passed by, he called out, "Miss Cole." She paused, turning to face him. "You're good at this," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. "I'll give you that." Brianna tilted her head, studying him. "I'm not here to be good at this, Mr. Weaver. I'm here because I have to be." With that, she walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. But as she stepped into the hallway, away from the prying eyes of the gallery, she allowed herself a moment to exhale. The battle was exhausting, but the stakes were too high to falter now. Weaver, still at his table, stared down at the binder left by the bailiff. He ran a hand through his hair, the confident young prosecutor from earlier replaced by a man wrestling with doubt. For the first time, he wondered if he was on the wrong side of this fight. The courtroom air felt thick, the kind of silence that crackles with anticipation. Judge Calloway leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His tone was measured, but his words carried an unmistakable edge. "Miss Cole, are you suggesting that this court is complicit in racial bias?" Brianna stood firm, her gaze unwavering. "I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that the law was not applied equally in this case. And if unequal application is upheld here, then yes, this court would share responsibility, intentionally or not." A murmur rippled through the gallery, hushed whispers and exchanged glances filling the room. Calloway's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. His fingers tapped once on the bench, the sound reverberating in the tense silence. Before he could respond, a voice from the gallery cut through the tension. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The room turned as one, the voice's source revealed to be a woman standing near the back. She stepped forward confidently, her press badge swinging from her neck like an emblem of authority. "And who might you be?" Calloway asked, narrowing his eyes. "Linda Carmichael, investigative journalist," she replied, her tone crisp and deliberate. "I've been following this case closely and have uncovered evidence that could corroborate Miss Cole's claims." Weaver's face paled. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A journalist can't simply interject." Calloway raised a hand, silencing him. "Miss Carmichael, this court doesn't typically entertain outside interventions. What evidence are you referring to?" Linda held up a flash drive. "A comprehensive review of inspection records across districts. It includes statistical evidence of disproportionate enforcement targeting minority vendors. If the court permits, I can present it now." The judge hesitated, his gaze flickering to Brianna, then to Weaver. "Finally," he sighed. "Approach the bench." As Linda handed the drive to the bailiff, Weaver seethed. "Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial." "Enough, Mr. Weaver," Calloway snapped, his patience clearly fraying. "This court will consider all relevant evidence. If Miss Cole's claims hold water, this could have far-reaching implications." While the files loaded onto the court's computer, Brianna watched the proceedings with quiet intensity. She had expected resistance, even outrage. What she hadn't anticipated was the dawning realization on some of the jurors' faces, their shifting postures and uneasy glances signaling that they were beginning to see the bigger picture. When the data appeared on the screen, Linda stepped forward. Your Honor, this heat map highlights the areas where vendors were cited most frequently over the past 2 years. The red zones correlate almost entirely with predominantly black neighborhoods. Meanwhile, wealthier, predominantly white areas remain largely untouched. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. The evidence was damning. Weaver stood abruptly. Correlation doesn't imply causation, Your Honor. This could be explained by factors like complaint frequency or even implicit bias, Brianna interjected, her voice cutting through his argument like a blade. Weaver turned on her, his composure cracking. Miss Cole, you're not an expert in this field. You can't possibly. I'm not just a vendor, Mr. Weaver, Brianna said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of restrained fire. The courtroom stilled as every eye turned to her. She took a step forward, her movements deliberate and commanding. Before I started my food truck business, she said, her tone calm but resolute, I was a judge. The declaration hung in the air like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed through the gallery, and Weaver froze mid-retort, his jaw slack with disbelief. A judge, Calloway repeated, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Yes, Your Honor, Brianna said, her gaze meeting his. For 6 years, I presided over cases in this very state, but I stepped away when I realized that justice doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins in the systems that bring people here in the first place. Weaver sank into his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating. Calloway leaned back, his hand running over his face as he processed this revelation. Linda Carmichael broke the stunned silence. Her perspective is unique, Your Honor. She's not just fighting for herself, she's exposing systemic flaws that go beyond this courtroom. Calloway exhaled slowly, his voice regaining its measured cadence. Miss Cole, why didn't you disclose this sooner? Because this isn't about who I was, Brianna replied. It's about the patterns we allow to persist. My past shouldn't matter any more than my race or my occupation. But if it takes revealing my title to make this court take me seriously, so be it. Her words struck like a hammer, shattering any remaining veneer of impartiality in the room. Even Calloway looked momentarily shaken, the weight of her argument pressing down on him. Weaver cleared his throat, but his voice was weak. Your Honor, I request a recess to review this new evidence and Miss Cole's disclosure. Calloway nodded, his expression unreadable. Granted, this court will reconvene in 1 hour. Bailiff, secure the evidence. As the gavel struck, the room erupted into hushed conversations. Brianna gathered her belongings methodically, ignoring the stares and whispers around her. She had anticipated resistance. What she hadn't expected was the mixture of admiration and unease now emanating from her opponents and supporters alike. Weaver, still seated, watched her with a mixture of resentment and begrudging respect. Calloway lingered at the bench, his thoughts visibly weighing on him. Brianna paused at the door, her back straight and her chin held high. For the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. The battle was far from over. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Calloway reluctantly waved Linda Carmichael forward. His fingers drummed impatiently on the bench. Make it quick, he muttered, his tone strained, as though the weight of recent revelations had already begun to settle on his shoulders. Linda stepped forward, handing him a thick folder. These are interviews with several other vendors who corroborate Miss Cole's claims. Some have admitted they were told outright that enforcement officers wouldn't bother them. Others, ashamed, said they saw Miss Cole being unfairly targeted but were too scared to speak out. She paused, watching as Calloway flipped through the pages, his face growing more tense with each one. But it was the last statement that made him stop entirely. There's one vendor who said, Linda's voice dropped lower, they told me they weren't interested in shutting me down because I didn't look like her. The words hung in the air like a weight, and the room went silent. Brianna stood still, her posture straight, knowing the power of that statement wasn't in the vendor's words alone, but in the ugly truth it revealed. The injustice, the bias. Calloway's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He looked at the evidence in his hands with growing unease. Each testimony seemed to deepen the shadows behind his thoughtful exterior. "I'm sure you've seen things like this before, Judge," Brianna said softly, breaking the silence. "But I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fair treatment for myself and for anyone else trying to build something honest." Her words lingered, and the judge lifted his gaze to meet hers. It wasn't just her determination that struck him now, it was the integrity that burned in her eyes. A quiet strength rooted in conviction. For the first time, he truly saw Brianna Cole, not just the food vendor, but a woman standing up against a system that had failed her. And suddenly, something shifted within him. "Miss Cole," Calloway said slowly, the words catching in his throat as his mind raced. "Why does your name sound familiar?" She hesitated, then sighed, as though weighing the consequences of her next words. "Perhaps because I've stood where you are now, Your Honor." The courtroom seemed to freeze. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, and every eye turned toward her. "I beg your pardon." Calloway's voice wavered, disbelief flooding his expression. "I'm a retired judge," Brianna said quietly. "I served on the state circuit court for nearly a decade before stepping down to pursue community work." At her words, the entire room erupted into whispers. The tension was palpable as everyone processed this new revelation, this sudden shift in their understanding of Brianna Cole. Calloway's face flushed with something akin to regret. He had been so quick to dismiss her, to assume that her complaints were those of someone who simply didn't understand the system. But now, in the face of her calm honesty, his assumptions crumbled. As the whispers swirled around him, Calloway's mind went quiet, and the noise of the courtroom seemed to fade away. He leaned back in his chair, staring at Brianna as she stood before him, unfazed by the reactions she had ignited. But inside, he was far from calm. He was beginning to see what had been right in front of him all along. He had spent years presiding over cases, many of them involving racial bias. He had seen the disparities, heard the complaints, but always chalked it up to a few isolated incidents. He had convinced himself that the system was fair, or at the very least, that he was doing his best to ensure it was. But Brianna's words cut through that illusion. He thought of cases he'd overseen, decisions he'd made, where he had turned a blind eye to subtle signs of bias, small injustices that hadn't seemed significant at the time. How many times had he let a case slip by without pushing harder, without questioning the motives behind certain actions? How many vendors had he allowed to be swept aside, simply because they didn't look like the right type? And now here she was, a former judge, standing up and speaking out. A woman who could have hidden behind her past, could have chosen to live quietly with the weight of it all. Instead, she chose to expose the truth. His fingers tightened around the folder in his hands. He could feel the regret building, a knot of guilt forming in his chest. He had dismissed Brianna's argument too easily. He had thought of her as just another vendor with a grievance, not someone who had seen how the system truly worked, and had the courage to call it out. "I didn't know," Calloway muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible as he reflected on the missed opportunities in his own career. "I didn't realize." Brianna's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're not the only one, Your Honor, but we can't afford to ignore the truth anymore. Not when people's livelihoods and dignity are at stake." He looked up at her, his expression heavy with a mixture of regret and newfound respect. "You're right," he said quietly, the weight of his realization settling in. "I've spent too long pretending the problem wasn't mine to address. But it is, and now it's time to fix it." Linda Carmichael, still standing to the side, watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. The battle wasn't over yet, but she could see the cracks forming in the armor of the system. Brianna had done more than just stand up for herself. She had shaken the very foundation of this courtroom, forcing those in power to confront the biases they had long ignored. As Calloway turned toward the rest of the room, signaling for the hearing to continue, Linda's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it briefly, then turned her attention back to the unfolding moment. Brianna had made her point, and now the courtroom would never look the same. The truth had come out. Now, the real work would begin. Calloway sat back in his chair, stunned. "You're a former judge." "Yes," Brianna replied simply, her gaze steady. "And if I may say so, I know how easy it is to get caught up in procedure and overlook context. but the law is meant to serve justice, not just rules. There was a brief silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Calloway felt a wave of heat rise to his face. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such remarks, especially not from someone who had once worn the same robe. Yet her words didn't come off as condescending or accusatory. They came from someone who had walked his path and understood its pressures and limits. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unexpected discomfort. "Miss Cole, Judge Cole, Brianna, I need time to review this new evidence. I'll reconvene in 2 weeks with a ruling on your case." Brianna nodded, her expression serene, but there was a glint of something deeper in her eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor." Calloway took a deep breath, looking at her with newfound respect. Then, just before she turned to leave, he gave a subtle nod, the faintest acknowledgement of her wisdom. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it signified a shift. Not just in their dynamic, but in his own perspective, one that was beginning to embrace the weight of what Brianna had said. Outside the courthouse, a swarm of reporters surrounded Brianna, eager for statements. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, but she kept her focus elsewhere, on the vendors who had stood by her side, waiting in solidarity just beyond the media frenzy. Her eyes met theirs, and she broke through the chaos, stepping toward them. She raised her voice just loud enough for those nearest to hear, her words carrying a calm, steady strength. "Justice isn't always swift," she told them, "but it's worth fighting for." His fingers tightened around the folder in his hands. He could feel the regret building, a knot of guilt forming in his chest. He had dismissed Brianna's argument too easily. He had thought of her as just another vendor with a grievance, not someone who had seen how the system truly worked and had the courage to call it out. "I didn't know," Calloway muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible as he reflected on the missed opportunities in his own career. "I didn't realize." Brianna's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're not the only one, Your Honor, but we can't afford to ignore the truth anymore. Not when people's livelihoods and dignity are at stake." He looked up at her, his expression heavy with a mixture of regret and newfound respect. "You're right," he said quietly, the weight of his realization settling in. "I've spent too long pretending the problem wasn't mine to address, but it is, and now it's time to fix it." Linda Carmichael, still standing to the side, watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. The battle wasn't over yet, but she could see the cracks forming in the armor of the system. Brianna had done more than just stand up for herself. She had shaken the very foundation of this courtroom, forcing those in power to confront the biases they had long ignored. As Calloway turned toward the rest of the room, signaling for the hearing to continue, Linda's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it briefly, then turned her attention back to the unfolding moment. Brianna had made her point, and now the courtroom would never look the same. The truth had come out. Now the real work would begin. Calloway sat back in his chair, stunned. "You're a former judge." "Yes," Brianna replied simply, her gaze steady. "And if I may say so, I know how easy it is to get caught up in procedure and overlook context. But the law is meant to serve justice, not just rules." There was a brief silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Calloway felt a wave of heat rise to his face. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of such remarks, especially not from someone who had once worn the same robe. Yet her words didn't come off as condescending or accusatory. They came from someone who had walked his path and understood its pressures and limits. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unexpected discomfort. "Miss Cole, Judge Cole, Brianna, I need time to review this new evidence. I'll reconvene in 2 weeks with a ruling on your case." Brianna nodded, her expression serene, but there was a glint of something deeper in her eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor." Calloway took a deep breath, looking at her with newfound respect. Then, just before she turned to leave, he gave a subtle nod, the faintest acknowledgement of her wisdom. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it signified a shift, not just in their dynamic, but in his own perspective, one that was beginning to embrace the weight of what Brianna had said. Outside the courthouse, a swarm of reporters surrounded Brianna, eager for statements. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, but she kept her focus elsewhere, on the vendors who had stood by her side, waiting in solidarity just beyond the media frenzy. Her eyes met theirs, and she broke through the chaos, stepping toward them. She raised her voice just loud enough for those nearest to hear, her words carrying a calm, steady strength. "Justice isn't always swift," she told them, "but it's worth fighting for." The crowd murmured in agreement, and for a moment, Brianna felt the weight of their gratitude, but more importantly, the sense of shared purpose. This fight wasn't just hers anymore. Weeks later, in a courtroom much quieter than the one where her battle had played out, Judge Calloway dismissed the charges against Brianna. He also ordered a full audit of the city's permit enforcement policies, a landmark decision that would have rippling effects across the city. Though his courtroom returned to its usual rhythm, Calloway carried with him the memory of Brianna's case, a quiet reminder that even those who wear the robes of authority are not immune to blind spots. Meanwhile, Brianna returned to the work that mattered most to her, not just running her food cart, but mentoring other vendors, teaching them how to navigate the system, and ensuring that no one else would have to fight as hard for fairness. She often said, "Injustice is just a chapter. The real story is how you rewrite it." As Brianna stood in the midst of the bustling vendors, a smile tugged at her lips. One of the vendors, a man who had been with her since the beginning, clapped her on the back. "Thank you, Brianna," he said with a grin. "We wouldn't be here without you." Her smile deepened as she looked around at the small community she had helped create. The carts were set up, steaming with fresh food, the sounds of the marketplace humming all around her. It wasn't just a victory in court, it was a victory in life, one that would continue long after the courtroom doors had closed. The fight wasn't over, but today it felt like a good place to pause. Brianna's work was far from finished, but it was a testament to the fact that change was possible, and that no matter the obstacles, justice would always find its way.